For the record, my name is Danny Smythe. I'm the Chief of Police. I'm going to get right into it. On December 1st, the WPS released information about additional murder charges against Jeremy Skibicki for the murder of Buffalo woman, Morgan Harris, and Mercedes Myron. On December 2nd, after a public police board meeting, I indicated that investigators believe the remains of the victims were in a landfill. This information had not been covered the previous day. I did not identify the specific landfill, but did indicate we were not contemplating an additional search. Now, many assumed that I was referring to the Brady landfill. Since then, there has been much reporting and speculation about the police search and recovery operations. It is important for us to set the record straight. Investigators believe that the remains of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron are at the Prairie Green landfill north of the city. Now, out of respect for the families, we have taken the position that we would not share information publicly without first sharing the information with the affected families. We recognize that this information is sensitive and traumatic, and steps were taken to honor that commitment. The things we are talking about today are horrific, and we know that they can be triggering, particularly to those impacted by missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. We are doing our best to be transparent while understanding that the integrity of the prosecution is important. We don't want to inadvertently compromise the prosecution. We all want justice for Buffalo woman, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Rebecca Contois. Now with me today is Inspector Cam McKidd. He is in charge of our forensics unit, and he oversaw the search and recovery of Rebecca Contois at the Brady landfill. He also saw the development of operational plans that were considered at the Prairie Green landfill. Ultimately, the forensics unit brought forward a report to the executive in June that left us with no hope that there would be a successful recovery. The circumstances, combined with the safety hazard, formed the basis of a difficult decision not to go forward with a search at Prairie Green. Now, I've asked Cam to join me today to run through a very similar presentation that he presented to us back then, just to give a more fulsome understanding of the circumstances that I'm talking about. So with that, Cam.
Sure. Be able to slide that over a touch? Perfect. Yep. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. This will be a little less formal than you would expect from the podium normally. I don't have a lot of prepared comments, but I'm hoping we can engage in a sort of a question and answer once I'm done my presentation. That might be the best way for us to be completely transparent to the extent that I can be in light of the ongoing investigation. I do have a couple prepared comments to sort of set the context, and then I'll take you through a few slides that might provide a visual to sort of better explain the situation we're dealing with. So as I said, I'm here today in the hopes of providing some transparency with respect to the landfill searches. As I'm sure you can appreciate, and as Chief Smythe alluded to, there's an ongoing investigation, so my comments may be vague. I may not be able to answer some questions, and if that's the case, you're welcome to forward questions through the PIO to either Sean Pike, the Inspector of the Homicide Division, or myself. If it's things I can't address here today, and we have to take some time to consider the questions, by all means, send them to us through the PIO. Be happy to answer them, or at least give you a response as to why we can't answer them. By way of background, on June 15th, 2022, I briefed you regarding a successful search that took place at the Brady landfill with respect to the remains of Rebecca Contois. I won't rehash what I went through at that press conference, but just for the record, I have spoken publicly on this in the past. All I'll do is fast forward to the date here. On June 20th, 2022, our unit was approached by the homicide unit. And again, I'm in charge of the forensic services unit. And we were advised that they had, their investigation had led them to believe that on or about May 16th, 2022, additional human remains from a different victim had been disposed at a privately owned landfill, which Chief Smythe described, the Prairie Green landfill located at Toshek Road and Highway number 7 in the RM of West St. Paul. The forensic services unit was tasked with assessing the Prairie Green site with a view to conducting an additional search for these additional human remains. So what I'll do here, given that we had just completed the search at Brady, we had a lot of information in terms of the difficulties, the health and safety hazards that we would encounter to search, and it was fresh in our minds. So with respect to the new site that had come to light at Prairie Green, we were able to sort of compare and contrast the two sites with respect to our operational capabilities. So I'll take you through that. What you're seeing in this slide here is a May 2022 overhead shot of the Brady landfill site where we conducted the search for the remains of Rebecca Contois. As you can see, on the left of the screen there, you can see the camp that we set up there. There's a trailer and some police vehicles. This site is approximately 4 acres. And as I described last time I was at this podium regarding this search, the debris in this site was, as you would sort of expect, when a dump truck would dump debris, it's above grade. It wasn't compacted. And it made this search, the conditions for this search preferable. As I said, if it's non-compacted, it's about 4 acres, above grade. And this is a shot here from land level. So when our searchers are going through this site, this is sort of the material they're going through, and they're doing it with the help of equipment. Heavy equipment would take some of this refuse. They would take it into an area, like a search area, and they would sift it out for our searchers. And then we would go through it methodically by hand with hand tools and by hand. And once we'd cleared that debris and we didn't find any remains, we'd rinse and repeat. That debris would be moved to a different location, and the machines would bring our searchers a second load. But this is very typical of what we were going through at the Brady site. Again, it's above grade, it's non-compacted to a large extent, which made it, I hate to use the word easy, but it made it reasonable for our people to go through. Very difficult, but manageable. It was a task that we could break up into pieces day by day and progress through this 4-acre site using some technology that I'll talk about soon here. This is just one more shot, just for context. These are some of our workers in the hazmat equipment, and you can see the heavy equipment in the background sorting the debris for us. So this site here is the Prairie Green site. It's about 4 acres as well, but as you can see, it's a completely different topography. What I'll do, I've got a chart here that you'll have access to in the slides. But we compare this site to the Brady site, and we also have some additional comparisons in terms of investigationally what made this site considerably more difficult to entertain in terms of a search than the Brady site. So I'm going to go through these items with you one by one, and then we'll take you through a few more slides here of the Prairie Green site. Actually, I'll do that right now just so you can get a look at the different angles here. So what you're seeing on the top there is heavy construction mud. I believe there's 9,000 tons between the time that the remains were thought to have been deposited there and police awareness. So that's an important part, and I'll start on that because it's the first item I have on my comparison chart here. The Brady site, as we discussed previously, we were able to shut that site down within about several hours, 3 to 5 hours. We were able to shut that site down, and that's the time between the remains were deposited there and the time we became aware of it was just several hours. In that time, just for context, within those few hours at the Brady site, 100 truckloads dumped in the same area where the remains of Rebecca Contois were dumped. So that's a massive amount of refuse. And when it's dumped, it's not just dumped in a static position. Literally the moment it's dumped, there's heavy equipment pushing, bulldozing, moving it, crushing it, and that goes on constantly throughout the day. So when you picture a load of debris being dumped, it's not going to be in that spot very long. It's a matter of seconds before it's manipulated by heavy equipment. And that was the case at Brady. So having said that, in the several hours, that time window, which was very, very fast for us to shut down that site. And again, I spoke last time about the assistance we got from Brady. The management there was fantastic. As soon as they got word that there was an issue there and we might be looking for remains, that site was shut down, it was frozen. But within that time, 100 additional truckloads, just in a few hours, were deposited there, just to give you an idea of how quickly the refuse builds in these locations. So with respect to Prairie Green, this site you see here, the time between the remains being deposited and the police awareness was 34 days, obviously substantially longer. During that time, by comparison, there were 10,000 truckloads that dumped in that same area. So an awful lot of material. So again, the initial search area of both sites are similar, but with respect to Prairie Green, about 10,000 truckloads of debris were dumped subsequent to the load that we were interested in. With respect to the disposal area being compacted, as I mentioned at Brady, it wasn't compacted. We got there quick enough that it hadn't been filled over with clay or buried. It was something we could go through with conventional construction equipment and hand tools that our searchers were using. As you can see with Prairie Green, this has been compacted by 9,000 tons of wet, heavy construction clay. I'll give you a side profile of this. So here, what we had last time, that's from an aerial shot. This is the same area, but from the side. So as you can see, it's to a depth of about 40 feet. And you can see you can't really see the garbage. It's underneath that wet, heavy construction clay that's been packed and bulldozed and manipulated by heavy machinery for 34 days between the time of disposal and the time of our awareness. One of the issues we had at Brady that played to our favor was our ability to prioritize certain areas within that 4-acre site. We were able to do that because we could see the refuse from the sky. We were able to use our drone technology to try to target certain areas. I don't want to get into investigative techniques, but there were ways for us to hone in on areas that we'd be interested in looking at. With respect to Prairie Green, clearly we weren't able to use that sort of technology because it was buried under this construction clay. With Brady, we had the ability to sort on site. And what I mean by that is how I described the machinery could do a short excavation, move it for us to sort through, and then we could go through it by hand. Due to the volume of construction clay and the volume of material at the Prairie Green site, we wouldn't have that luxury. We would have to look at a secondary site to move this debris one truckload at a time to a secondary site and go through it at that site if we were to entertain a search. Another issue we looked at was the compaction in the actual garbage truck that picks up these different loads that we're talking about. In the instance of the Brady search, the truck that actually picked up the garbage on the route that day was not compacting along the way. The refuse wasn't compacted in the truck. With respect to Prairie Green, it was just a different make of truck. It compacts the garbage several times during the course of the route, which would make potentially the remains we're looking for less discernible given the compaction. Another item that played to our favor with respect to the Brady search was the truck that was on the route that day had GPS installed. So that allowed us to pinpoint the specific point within the 4-acre site at Brady, at least give us a starting point where this was where it was dumped. We could hone in within several meters using GPS to get a starting point. The trucks that delivered to Prairie Green during this time in question, they weren't outfitted with GPS, so we didn't have that option. Similarly, the Brady truck had video, onboard video. That was helpful in terms of, again, I don't want to get into investigative techniques, but that was helpful to us and provided an avenue for us to sort of narrow the scope of our search. The video was not present in the truck, didn't have that capability with respect to Prairie Green. Another item we looked at was the heavy equipment that's used. At Brady, we were able to pinpoint where the load was dumped, and then for those several hours that we were interested in where the debris was being moved, the heavy machinery there actually has GPS. So we could track where the debris, in a general sense, what direction the debris was pushed, and that helped us focus our search to some extent. The heavy equipment at Prairie Green, it's not equipped with GPS. So that was another limiting factor in that we're always looking for a starting point, and yeah, you can see how the Brady search lined up. There's a lot of things favorable to our success there. None of those factors are present with the Prairie Green search. Animal remains is a big issue with respect to landfill searches. At Brady, there was an issue with animal remains, but due to the tight time window, we didn't have an issue with animal remains. We were able to sort of, as I said, zone in on the area that we were interested in, and that wasn't impacted by animal remains. The Prairie Green, by comparison, in the time between disposal and police awareness, 1,500 tons of animal remains were deposited between May 16th and June 20th and spread throughout that site. Additionally, asbestos is always a concern. At Brady, again, we were able to segment the areas we're searching and avoid having to deal with the health and safety issues involved in working with asbestos. With respect to Prairie Green, that unfortunately there were 250 tons of asbestos spread throughout that site between those dates, between May 16th and June 20th. They do make some effort to put the asbestos around the sides of this area here. But there is no guarantee, in speaking with management there's no guarantee that it's not going to be strewn throughout that site. So that was another factor that sort of weighed into this. One other issue I would mention is at Brady, we dealt with, I forget the word now, hydrogen chloride? There's a dangerous gas that builds in dumps and swamps. And the hydrogen sulfide, I believe, sorry. And those levels were slowly increasing while we were searching for the Rebecca Contois remains. Towards the end of that search, once we were successful, we actually held that site for another 2 weeks. Just in the event, we were trying to be proactive, in the event that we knew this was an ongoing investigation, and in the event that additional remains were potentially located at that site, we held that site for an additional 2 weeks. But the dangerous gases reached an elevation that was actually becoming dangerous. It can become lethal. And we had ongoing discussions with Brady management over this, and it got to the point where the safety of their workers, we had to consider that. And certainly if we had to revisit searching that site, the levels were to the extent that we couldn't safely do that. So at that point, the site was released, and it was plowed over. So I hope that gives you a visual. Let me see here. So that's the side view of Prairie Green. You can see at the top there, just to the right of center, that's a huge excavator, just to give you a scale of the size of that. And that's from a distance. So again, it's about 40 feet in depth, 4 acres. And this is the chart that I was just kind of going through with you, but you folks you'll get this with your slides when we release this to you. So that's sort of what we were left. Essentially, with Prairie Green, we didn't have a starting point to search for the reasons I've discussed here today. There was no starting point for us. We had a 4-acre site, and the entire 4 acres were in play. For the reasons I've discussed, we were unable to prioritize any specific area of that 4 acres above any other area. So what we were left with is the potential task of searching for human remains across a 4-acre site that was 40 feet in depth, heavily compacted with 9,000 tons of wet, heavy construction clay, and distributed throughout the site was 250 tons of asbestos. In addition to that, we had 1,500 tons of animal remains strewn throughout the site, which would make it very difficult to discern human remains if we're conducting a search of that site. So these are some of the factors, excuse me, some of the factors that weighed into our my apologies, I've had a sore throat for about 2 months. So based on this, we presented to our executive, and I just feel it should be stated that when we're looking for human remains, or when it comes up that there might be human remains at a landfill, we approach that with the mindset that we're going to be searching. That's our default. That's our default mindset. It was with respect to Brady, and it was with respect to Prairie Green. But in the interest of the safety of our members doing the search, and whether or not we have any potential to be successful in that search, we have to look at the specific site and the issues it presents. And that's what we did here. And when we presented it, we made the very difficult decision as a service that this wasn't operationally feasible to conduct a search of this site. Yeah, and in the interest of full transparency, that's why I'm here today, is to sort of give you a visual of what we're looking at, and state unequivocally that our full intention when we receive information like this, we take it extremely seriously, and our intent from day one, from minute one, is to conduct a search. There are times, and this, I believe, is one of them, where a search just simply wasn't feasible for the reasons I've described today. And just as a side note, I know a lot of attention has been put on this, and rightfully so. It's a very emotional subject, and our hearts go out to the families and to the victims. And it's very delicate, and we'd like to speak more, but sometimes we just can't for reasons that are obvious. There's a criminal proceeding that's going on. I would say, though, that the members of our homicide unit and our forensics unit have been working around the clock for months on this. And I know the common perception is, well, that's your job, and I couldn't agree more. It is our job. But having said that, I've seen the emotional impact on the members of our homicide unit and our forensics unit. They're emotionally invested in this investigation, and they take it extremely seriously, and they take it home with them. So 100%, we're paid to do this job, and I'm not complaining. That's our job. But it's tough when we're being criticized for almost a lack of caring, when I don't think that's the case. Our members are working extremely hard in this case, and our hearts go out to the victims and their families, and we're working as hard as we can to ensure that the resolution here is what it should be. I had a few more notes here, but I could open it up to questions if there are any. Yes.
Buffalo Woman, is she believed to be at Prairie Green, or?
With Buffalo Woman, the investigation, it's still ongoing, but at this point, we do not have a definitive location for Buffalo Woman in terms of a specific landfill, and certainly not a specific area within a specific landfill. So I hope that answers your question. We do not know.
Can you tell us a bit more about the 34 days when you were notified, and then how police got back to that May 16th date? Like, what happened in that month plus?
That's the investigation, just proceeding. It took a long time. It's a very complicated investigation. It took some time for our homicide investigators to get to the point where they could then reach out to forensics and say, we have reason to believe there's remains at this site. It just takes time to work through the investigation.
So to be clear, police believe the remains of Ms. Harris and Ms. Moran are at Prairie Green?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, and I can clarify that. The time frame was such that when the garbage was picked up during this time frame, sometimes it's not picked up daily. Sometimes there's a pickup once a week, once every 2 weeks. In this case, our two additional victims were thought to be in the same load that went to Prairie Green.
Is Prairie Green the same kind of landfill as sort of household trash can go, or is it more of a construction trash?
I can't answer that, to be honest. I know we encountered a lot of the same hazards, but in terms of what's actually deposited there, I can't answer that, sorry.
You talked about, excuse me, the reasons that the search at Brady went well, or at least there were things in your favor.
Right.
People, members of the victims were at Parliament Hill today talking about how they wanted more resources. If you thought about all the things there, the packed mud, PPE for asbestos, if you had the machines to take everything to a secondary site, the tap of resources opened up, is there a world where you could look for the bodies at this site?
Probably not a question that I'm equipped to answer, to be honest. I know in terms of our capabilities and one of the concerns is certainly if we were to search that site, given the compaction that went on in the truck at the site, the decomposition that occurs over time, I guess the question to be asked, is it impossible? Nothing's impossible. But is it likely that even if remains were found, that they would be discernible from animal remains? It's a tough question. This was certainly beyond the scope of something that we thought was feasible from a WPS perspective.
Chief, I know there was a lot of pressure maybe to hold this briefing today. Do you have any last words that you'd like to say to people who've been calling for more searching or more accountability?
So I guess I would say this is not how we wanted it to end. And my heart goes out to the families. We were expecting and hoping for a different outcome. We were successful at Brady, and we used every resource in our means to do that. The circumstances dealt to us here are such that we don't have the same kind of circumstance. We acknowledge that the families are heartbroken. We acknowledge that they're angry, frankly. And we acknowledge that a lot of people are angry. We're doing our best to bring justice to the families, and that's what we hope to do. A successful search and recovery in this circumstance isn't feasible.
And Chief, did you or other members of I believe you met with the families?
I'm sorry?
Did you meet with the families to share all this information?
Yes. Yeah, the families were met before we released any of this publicly.
Has there been any conversations at the federal level, federal government?
I'm sorry?
Has there been any conversations with the federal government about searches and why it's not feasible?
No.
Given that the trucks at Prairie didn't have GPS, is there any discussion with the city to maybe have all of the trucks equipped with GPS at some point?
So I'm not sure of, and Cam alluded to it, the operations at Prairie Green, I don't believe it's a city operation. My understanding, and I could be wrong, it's more of a commercial dump. They're different trucks. They're not city trucks.
Chief, just on the point you just made about being disappointed that this is how this is concluded, and we have some very vocal voices in the community that, as was mentioned, went to Ottawa today. Here we are, we're on another missing and murdered case where there's an outcome that's disappointing to the police, it's disappointing to the community. How worried are you about your relationship with that community right now? They're vocally criticizing you. There are accusations that the police don't care. You've illustrated the position here. Just the relationship. How concerned are you about it going forward?
So we will always be in a state where we are constantly interacting with all of the community. I would characterize our relationship with the majority of the Indigenous community as a good one. We have a lot of partnership and interaction and support each other in the work that we do. I'll remind you that I testified on a panel at the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry with leaders of the Indigenous community where we presented a model that I think is a good one, and it's one that we continue to use. I think the efforts of our homicide unit to hold Mr. Skibicki accountable here and so that he can go to trial is important. I hope that we bring justice to the families. I'm disappointed that we're we're not in a position to recover remains for these other two victims. But you know, the efforts that we make to work with the Indigenous community, particularly the vulnerables, is something that we put a lot of time and effort into.
Chief, when you guys spoke to the family, I know you don't want to get into the specifics of the conversation, but I'm sure there was a similar explanation given. What was their reaction to that?
So I think you saw the reaction in the testimony this morning. They're frustrated, they're angry, they're heartbroken. I acknowledge that.
And is that's just where we have to leave it because the police won't be, you know, conducting a further search?
So you're making it sound like the police won't be, I think we've walked you through what we know. I would invite you to take a little bit of time to reflect and ingest on what we've told you here today. I don't think that the decision we made is the family's not happy with it. That part is clear, but I don't think we can safely conduct a search there.
Chief, one of the suggestions that was made in Ottawa by the group was that more resources be made available for searches. Maybe it wouldn't have made a difference in this case, but there are other missing people out there. The minister didn't turn his back on that idea. He seemed to suggest it had some merit. Is there some merit in having a pool of funding or something that police forces like yourself or Thunder Bay or Regina could tap when we know people are missing?
So funding was never an issue here. I just want to be clear on that. At no time was funding a consideration with our operations. Two things I would say to the comments you made. At no time were any of the people in Ottawa briefed on what you just were briefed on. So to a certain extent, their comments are not as well informed as what you are now. The second part I would say is I'm always open to working with governments if we can do things more effectively.
Inspector McKibb, I'm just trying to understand the timeline here. So, police believe Ms. Harris was killed around May 1 and Ms. Moran around May 4. And then one truck brought to Prairie Green on May 16th. Correct.
So just we understand that the research are impossible, but what's the next step for the police in this case?
What's the next steps for what?
For the police in this case?
I'm sorry.
I think she was asking what's the next step for the police in this case. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. My apologies. Yeah. So, again, we've got the jackets up here. Not a lot of attention's going on to that, and I would certainly emphasize we are trying to identify Buffalo women. We've had some response to our request. We are hoping to find additional information that will help us identify Buffalo women so that her family can have some closure as well. Other than that, we are preparing for a prosecution. As you know, we've disclosed our investigation to the Crown Prosecutor. They will be preparing for a prosecution. We're being very cautious about what we're talking about here because we don't want to inadvertently compromise anything going forward. So we're trying to be transparent, but we recognize we can't talk about a lot of the investigative detail.
You said you've had some tips or information. Can you explain how many tips?
I'm not going to get into numbers with you, Jeff, but we have had some. Our members are following that up. We're imploring. It's a pretty unique jacket. We're hoping it sparks somebody's memory, that they remember it.
A couple more questions.
We asked this the other day, but just given a few days have passed and there's been information. Is there any information to potentially point towards more victims?
No.
And I know we've asked about this and considering what you just said, but I mean, is there anything that either of you can say to how police came to conclude that they believe there's more victims when the victims' bodies are buried?
It's almost a cliche, but we go where the investigation takes us, whether that's a scene or whether that's suspects or whether it's evidence. And at this point, we have no information or evidence to suggest there are others. Can't get into details of what led us to the landfills, but it's the investigation that took us there.
Chief Smith, Inspector McKinn talked about the homicide unit, taking this case home with them. It's affected a lot of people who've heard about it, and certainly a lot of people who've worked on the case. If, if this was your daughter or your partner or a sibling or aunt, how would you feel if you know that there's basically no chance now that they're coming home?
I would be heartbroken and I would be angry.